Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to be starting something new. I'm going to be going chapter by chapter through What is the Bible by Rob Bell. And if you bear with me, this is the cover of it. Well, here, let me flip it around. There we go. What is the Bible? How an ancient library of poems, letters, and stories can transform the way that you think and feel about everything. Now, so the first chapter that we're starting off with is called Moses and His Moisture. It's a very interesting name for a chapter. So we start off with, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 34, we read that Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak nor his strength gone. And in general, when you're dying, your strength tends to be gone. So why does the writer want us to know that Moses' strength hasn't gone yet? Well, the Hebrew word that was translated into strength here was the word leho. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of that word, but it's L-E-H-O. And it literally translates to moisture or freshness. So when he died, his moisture hadn't left him. So he passes on, but he still has his freshness. And he had not become wrinkled. So this phrase with the word leho here apparently is a euphemism for sexual potency. And that is what the storyteller wants us to know here about Moses when he's dying, is that he can still get it up. And that is Rob Bell's words here. I'm quoting him from his book. And so why does the writer want the reader to know this? And if we look back a little earlier on in the book of Genesis, that Abraham is Moses' father, and he leaves his household, his father's household, and everything that he's familiar with, and he sets out on a journey for a new land, to a new place where he's never been before. And this was a totally new concept, because before this everyone had a very cyclical view of history and of life, and it's like you're born, you live a certain way, and you die somewhere in the cycle, and the cycle repeats itself, and everything that is happening to you now has already happened in the past and will happen again someday. So it was just kind of an endlessly repeating cycle. And so, in other words, there was nothing new happening. But when Abraham leaves, he steps out of the cycle, and he steps into this new future that has never happened before. And no one had ever done that, because no one had ever conceived of a future like that before. And it was a whole brand new idea for human history, that you're not stuck anymore, that you're not doomed to repeat everything that's already happened. And so not only was Abraham leaving behind his home and things that were familiar to him, but he was also leaving behind an entire way of life. Because earlier in Genesis, there was a progression of violence that started with Cain, a man named Cain who killed his brother Abel. And then it continues to escalate, and all of humanity is sort of spiraling downwards into a greater conflict and destruction. And by the end of chapter 11, right before we meet Abraham, people are setting up these empires that are meant to oppress the masses, and an entire system of perpetuating injustice. And so the storyteller wants us to realize that Abraham is leaving behind this system and all of this evil and the violence, and he has a destiny to fulfill, one where he becomes the father of a new kind of people who usher in a new era for humanity, and that's one based in love and not violence. And in chapter 12, Abraham is told that all people on earth will be blessed through you. And this was a whole new idea, that we are meant to bless people and not oppress them. And so how do you form a new kind of people that will take the world into a new direction? You have kids. And how do you have kids? You have sex. and sex involves moisture and freshness, which is what leho is. And so when the writer tells you that Moses wasn't wrinkled and his strength hadn't abated and that he still had his force, the writer's telling you that Moses was still able to participate in the creation of this new kind of tribe that would take the world into a new direction and away from all of that violence and destruction. And so then also it takes us back to when Moses led the people out of Egypt. And because for so long people asked themselves if their lives were set in stone and if things were unable to change or if they could be set free from the things that enslaved them. And so the story just tells you that you're not stuck. You're not trapped in old ways of thinking, old ways of life, and you're not doomed to live as your parents lived and their parents lived. And now, so not only is this a story of that, but it's also a warning. Rob Bell says, this is about Moses and Exodus, and the Exodus was also a warning to anyone who has ever bullied another person, anyone who has ever held their boot on the neck of someone that were dominating, anyone who has ever used their power and their strength to dehumanize and to exploit the weaknesses of others. Your days in power are numbered because the deepest forces of the universe are on the side of the oppressed, the underdog, and the powerless. And so for this Hebrew tribe then, passing this liberating and intoxicating idea along to the next generation, it was really, really important. And that's how you change the world, by entering into your own liberation and then passing it on to your children. And how do you have kids? You have sex. And what is involved in sex? Moisture and freshness. So by just taking this one line in Deuteronomy and you dig just a little bit deeper, you go into this. Well, let me read how Rob says it exactly. He says, we started with a few obscure English words in the 34th chapter of the 5th book of the Bible about a man named Moses, but then we dipped just a bit below the surface, and in no time we found a subtle, slightly crude, quite funny, sly, unexpected sexual euphemism that took us earlier in the story and then circled back to another story a bit later, and in no time we were dealing with violence and hope and despair and slavery and oppression and empires and imagination and human consciousness and the birth of new ideas that no one had ever had before. And you were reading along thinking about them back then, but when we talked about whether or not things can change or if they're set in stone and there's nothing you can do about it, you realized you've had these questions before in your own life, right? So the crazy thing about the Bible, and people say, why bother with this old book? It's because it's a book about them then, the people back that they were writing about, but it's also speaking to us, to our lives now. And it can change the way that you think and feel about everything. Absolutely everything going on in life. And let's see, what else? So Rob, here in this ending of the chapter, he addresses some questions. So this one says, but isn't it actually a library of books written across a number of years by people who didn't know each other, with agendas and opinions and limited perspectives? And Rob says, yes, of course it is. And it's even stranger than that, and we'll get into it. And then another question, but doesn't it promote violence and all sorts of primitive and barbaric behaviors that we've left behind? And Rob says, no, and I want you to see where that view comes from and why it's misguided. But you have to admit that there's a lot of violence in the Bible, like the violence that you skipped over just now in that retelling of the Exodus story, and a lot of it is done in the name of God or because the person believed God told them to do it. And Rob says, absolutely, there are a lot of those stories in the Bible, and we're going to explore a number of them because there's more going on there than most people realize. And then, but it seems like a lot of people who talk about the important and central and necessary, wait, sorry, I messed up. But it seems like a lot of the people who talk about, or who talk the most about how important and central and necessary the Bible is, seem to skip over and gloss and censor the most dangerous and interesting parts about sex and politics and power and the poor. And Rob says, yes, it's so true. And this is a dangerous, subversive, explicit, foul, honest, strange, contradictory, paradoxical, ruthlessly hopeful book that makes a number of rather stunning claims about pretty much everything. So, and then the next thing is, but isn't the Bible ultimately about Jesus and how there's a narrow way and a few people find it and everyone else is going to burn in hell? And Rob says, no, it's not. It's bigger and more expansive and inclusive and embracing and enlightened than that, because the Jesus story is bigger and more expansive and inclusive and challenging and dangerous and enlightened than that. But isn't it honestly quite boring? And Rob said, if you're bored by reading the Bible, then you're not reading the Bible. Well, then how do you read the Bible? That's what this book is about, because it's easy to read the Bible and miss an entire world of weirdness and joy and hope and innuendo and implication just below the surface. So this book is about that world. So let's start at the beginning. And then the next chapter, which I will go over in a different video, is called Somebody Wrote Something Down. And so that is a basic overview of chapter 1 of Rob Bell's What is the Bible? Rob Bell is just an awesome author. He has very interesting perspectives, a lot of different ideas that a lot of people skip over and don't really look that deeply into. A lot of people, when they're reading the Bible, kind of read it at surface level and take things very literally, when in reality the Bible's full of a lot of parables and things that look like they might be saying one thing but are saying another. And so it's very awesome how Rob goes into detail about like the context of these passages, and it reminds us that it's not a straightforward text. It's like there's a lot of bits and pieces from different places and times, and all of the authors were conveying something in each of their chapters and their sections, and it's important just actually to extract the meaning and extract the true message that they're trying to convey here, because otherwise you're reading it wrong. And so I'm excited to continue reading this with you guys. I actually am on chapter 4, and so I'm going to read ahead and kind of reread and go over with you guys these chapters. So I'm very excited to go through the next chapter with you guys, and so stay tuned. And as always, I hope you all have a beautiful and blessed day.